Artists usually resist analyzing themselves, but I've really found that there are some predominant motives for writing that really have guided me through my life. One motive for writing is self-expression, and maybe that's one of the most original. It's the self that you're expressing when you write in a diary. And I always encourage my students to keep a journal. I think we all need to keep journals, to write quietly and calmly at the end of the day, before you go to bed, to write in a journal. If you can write in longhand, that's really nice, because it's so intimate and so private. And to keep in contact with your innermost self. So this self-expression in a journal could turn into a work of art. I've kept a journal since I've been about 21 years old. Before that, I had a diary sporadically. When I started keeping a journal, which was just immensely helpful. The journal is helpful in ways that you can't anticipate, because when you're traveling particularly, you're moving so swiftly through space and time that you don't really have time to absorb very much. So whatever you can write down in a journal that's descriptive, it doesn't have to be elegant writing. It can lots of dashes, and breathless writing is really best. To take notes very quickly, impressionistically, describing places and your own reactions to the places. And if you can put a little dialogue in, some exchanges you've had with people. Well, keeping a journal sharpens our senses. It's like an exercise in writing. If you're describing a scene, you are practicing the act of writing, which is very important, and thinking in language. Otherwise, you just sort of go through the day with the stray thoughts are floating around in your head of no particular distinction. But if you're writing things down and really thinking about something and observing, that gives a certain sharpness to your powers of observation. As time goes by, when you look back over those entries that had seemed so ordinary, they become really interesting. To look back like 15, 17, 20 years, some people can look back 40 years. Like looking back through a tunnel into the depths of time. It is so interesting. But as I said, you can't anticipate how important it will be when you're doing it, because you're just caught up in the moment. So you have to have faith that sometime in the future you'll look back upon this with really, really interesting. The kind of writing people do when they don't have time is also important. So I suggest to my students, you start writing when you only have 40 minutes, and write really, really fast. So you don't have time. Like you have 8 hours, you're intimidated. It's too much time. Well, I could also say that writing when you're feeling very tired is a good idea. Writing when you've been up late, writing when you're ready to go to bed, and you're really, really tired, or you're feverish, or not feeling well, say to yourself, I'm only going to write for 6 minutes. Well, 8 minutes. Well, I'll write for 12 minutes. And then write very quickly. And then the next morning when you see what you've written, that might be really worthwhile. Don't fuss, and don't take too much time. It's like the opposite of another course, where you work hard. Say, do this fast. Particularly with a short story or a novella, which is basically a short novel, it's very, very helpful to know what your first sentence is and the first scene, and then go for a long walk or a run or a bicycle ride and try to see the whole thing as a movie. Now, you can't really do that with a novel because it's just too complicated, but a story or novella, you could tell the whole story to yourself without any language, but like a little movie without any dialogue. Then when you come back home, you rapidly take notes. I take them in longhand, just as fast as I can write. But you could type on a laptop. And just take any notes, no chronological order, just anything. little snatches of dialogue. Anything that you remember that's memorable and important will come floating back up. And then the next time you'd go on a run or a walk or a bicycle ride, you sort of do the whole thing over again, and this time you get different things come to you, and things that you maybe weren't working on the first time, you work on the second time, you know. So basically you're accruing all these notes, and I have a lot of notes. So as I said, I write it in longhand. I take a piece of paper and fold it lengthwise. So I have a piece of paper and I just write a lot of notes. So my archives at Syracuse are filled with all these notes, basically, like thousands of pages of these things. Once I've accumulated a lot of notes, for a novel it could be 200 pages. It's a big folder. But for a short story, it won't be that long. I accumulate these notes, and then I go to the laptop and I transcribe them from my handwriting to the laptop. So then I have scenes, and could be 12 pages, could be 20 pages. And then I have something I can work with. A lot of my notes are just jottings. And typically I would have lists of things I wanted to put in a novel, and like the certain kind of furniture. If you're populating a novel set in the 19th century, you have to have special furniture, you have to do a little research. So I have the brocade and the braid, carved mahogany, trefoil piercing. I don't even remember what that is, but I knew that. Turkish overstuffed chairs, rosewood, 1830s French Empire period, things that notes, you know. And then I would check them off what I put in the novel. So here I've only had a couple checks, so I didn't use most of it. Black wood and gilt. That means that I can take this and use it now because I didn't use much. Laminated carved rosewood, I checked that. Cottage furniture. Hickory rocker with a rush seat, I never used it, so I can put it in my next story. Stuffed birds under glass dome, I used that one. Jenny Lind type cherry spool bed, 1850. So I never used that, so anybody can have it. Walnut overstuffed tete-a-tete lounging shelves for Sumuri puppets. So weird. Hanging kerosene burning lamp, alabaster paperweights, rice paper lanterns. I didn't use that, so people can use that. A lot of here, things I never used. Sienna marble. But I did use a settee with a haircloth upholstery and carved tendrils, so I used that. All these things are in the novel somewhere. All sorts of things I got out of research books. And then little notes about characters. A certain kind of flower, a white flower, insectivorous, carnivorous, waxen, pallid, lily-like flower. This is a flower, I may have made that up, because I think that's in my novel, The Accursed. It's a poisonous, beautiful flower that I actually made up because it doesn't have any name here. So I guess nobody can use that because I've used that. There are a number of distinguished writers, among them Virginia Woolf and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry David Thoreau, and actually John Cheever, many writers actually. There's a profound distinction between their written fiction and the journals. They didn't write the journals to be published. The written fiction, and the example of Virginia Woolf, for instance, the fiction is very, very polished and very mannered. Virginia Woolf perfected a style that some people think is very beautiful and other people can't even read. It's extremely fastidious and sort of floating, impressionistic. It's beautiful in a way, but it doesn't have much body. She doesn't really see things. She feels a lot of things. Now, by contrast, the journal is almost the opposite. In a journal, she's sharp, She's funny, she's nasty, she's very catty, she's sarcastic. She says things about people she would never have said in her novels, and she would never have said, I think, in real life, but in the journal, she just is completely uncensored. These journals were published by Leonard Woolf, her husband, after she died, and they're called A Writer's Diary. And I recommend them for young and new writers because they're just wonderful. You start reading the Writer's Diary of Virginia Woolf, immediately you start thinking about keeping a diary because they're so good. So I'll read just a little bit here, but the whole thing is wonderful. So this is Tuesday in March 1930, and it's just all one long paragraph, and it just sort of goes on. She's talking to herself. All because I have to buy myself a dress this afternoon and can't think what I want and cannot read. I have written fairly well, but it's a difficult book, but can't keep on after 12, and now shall write here for 20 minutes. So she's been working on The Waves, which is one of these very eloquent, fastidious novels, and she's exhausted with that. So now she takes up her pen, and she's just writing in this journal. She's really enjoying it because she doesn't have to make it into this fiction. My impressions of Margaret Davies and Lillian Harris at Monk's house were of great lumps of gray coat, straggling wisps of hair, hats floppy and homemade, thick woolen stockings, black shoes, many wraps, shabby handbags, and shapelessness and shabbiness and dreariness and drabness unspeakable. A tragedy in its way. Margaret, at any rate, deserved better of life than this disheveled and undistinguished end. They're in lodgings, as usual, have, as usual, a wonderful Christian Science landlady, somehow rejected by active life, sit knitting perhaps and smoking cigarettes in the parlor, where they have their meals, where there's always left the dishes of oranges and bananas. I doubt if they have enough to eat. They seem to me flabby and bloodless, spread into rather toneless chunks of flesh, having lost any commerce with looking glasses. So we showed them the garden and gave them tea, and then, oh, the dismal sense of people stranded, wanting to be energized, drifting, all woolly and hairy. There is a blue spark in Margaret's eye now and then, but she had not been out of the lodgings for 5 weeks because of the east wind. Her mind has softened and wrinkled, sitting indoors with the oranges and cigarettes. Lillian is almost stone deaf and mumbles and crumbles, emerging clearly only once to discuss politics. Something has blunted Margaret's edge, rusted it, worn it, long before its time. Must old age be so shapeless? Well, she never thought anybody would be reading this, let alone reading it out loud. But you see the contrast between her writer self and the journal. Her characters tend to be more elevated and more educated than these people. But when she wanted to cast the sharp eye on other people, she was really devastating. Now, I personally prefer her diary to her fiction. And I know people will be very upset to hear that because Virginia Woolf is one of these saints of the 20th century. I like her diary better, and I like the voice. She's much more of a woman in the journal than she is in her fiction. In the fiction, she's very asexual. There's no eroticism and no sense of people, no romance, really. But in the journal, she's sort of down there looking at people's flesh and looking at their hair and noticing smells. She said Catherine Mansfield smelled like a cat, some awful thing that she would never have said in actual life. So I think if we could bring that kind of honesty and directness to the journal, it's a prose style that's really very wonderful. An assignment I definitely recommend for new writers to read Virginia Woolf's wonderful essay, Moments of Being. And this is another work from her diary where she's writing so candidly and so directly. A moment of being is a time in your life, maybe rare, when you have a real insight, a real epiphany. Sometimes people get they get these overwhelming feelings in times of stress, or there may be a death in the family. And Virginia Woolf writes about having heard that somebody had died or somebody committed suicide. And she gives 3 examples. 2 of them are very shocking, and the other is mystical. She's looking at a garden, and she sees how the flowers are part of a mystic whole. And when I read that, I understand that Virginia Woolf is having a mystical experience such as people have when they meditate on a mandala. So Virginia Woolf suggests, which I would suggest to you also, to take a moment of being in your own life. You could have been a child. I'd like to think that the first awareness of mortality in a child is absolutely profound. Because I remember when I was told my grandfather had died, I was stunned. I didn't think my grandfather could die. I had no idea what that meant. And then when my grandfather didn't come home, that was utterly astonishing. You know, like he wasn't there anymore. And people feel that way about pets, like a dog or cat has died. Something's missing. You know, it's so palpable in absence. The absence is a presence, you know. So a moment of being doesn't have to be morbid. It could be it could be happiness also. Or you could have a reconciliation. When you reconcile with somebody you thought you hated you, and then you reconciled, and there was this burst of happiness. That could be a